Let me introduce Dr. Thompson. He is the husband of his wife Phyllis for over 3 decades. They have 2 adult children, both under 30 at this point. One lives in the D.C. area, the other lives in Roanoke, Virginia. Dr. Thompson and his wife also reside in Northern Virginia. He has a practice there, but he also loves to do what he's doing today and tomorrow, and that is venture out into other locations and share this message that God has gifted him with in terms of the integration of the brain with our lives, our heart, our actions. And so we're very excited about Dr. Thompson being with us today. I was thinking how I could appropriately introduce him. I just want to read just a quote from his first book, The Anatomy of the Soul. And you probably know this, but both of his books are available in the back. We encourage you to take care and purchase those. But let me read this quote to you from his book, The Soul of Shame. I will argue that it is only through the process of being known that you come to know yourself and learn how to know others. There is no other way. To be known is to be pursued, examined, and shaken. To be known is to be loved and have hopes and even demands placed on you. It is to rise not only the furniture, it is to risk not only the furniture in your home being rearranged, but your floor plans being rewritten, your walls being demolished and reconstructed. To be known means that you allow your shame and guilt to be exposed in order for them to be healed. Dr. Thompson, would you come and share with us this morning?
Well, here you are. Here we all are. Thank you so much for coming out on this cool Saturday afternoon. I bring you greetings from an even warmer place in the country. I understand it got down to 91 degrees last night in Arlington, Virginia. So thanks be to God I wasn't there. I want to say that anytime I'm in a space like this, where people have come for us to grapple with these things, one of the things that I want to quickly mention is that the work that we're going to do here in this time is you might think that you've come here to hear information. In fact, you're going to get information over the next several hours, and we hope it's information that's going to be useful for you. But I want to assure you that when you leave here today, you're not going to be much smarter than when you walked in. And you're like, why am I here if I'm not going to be much smarter? Here's the point. The point is that the speakers who are going to be addressing things with you, and they're going to be addressing things that are hugely important. Our job is not to confuse getting smarter with the acquisition of wisdom. Our job is to inspire you to go home and do the work, which is what a lot of this will amount to at the end of the day. Because I want to say that doing the work that we're doing, that we're talking about, is indeed difficult to do. It's hard to do. And one of the things we like to tell people is that the brain is willing to do lots of things that are really difficult as long as it doesn't have to do it by itself. And so we listen to and pay attention to that kind of primary anthropological statement that we read in Genesis chapter 2, where the writer says, it's not good for man to be alone. And our brains and neuroscience that is emerging would tell us this. And so we know that the work that we long to go home and do with rigor as we leave here is work that we are going to be best able to do if we're doing it with other people. And so my encouragement for us today is not just that we learn things, but that we are going to be continually working with other people as we try to make this stuff part of who we are in order for us to be people who are helpful for other people. So with that in mind, I also want to say this. Anytime you were to come to a gathering like this and you're going to listen to a speaker, one of the first things that would be reasonable to hear from the speaker is where they're coming from. Now, most of the time you're not going to hear that from speakers, but I just want to, because I don't know exactly where everybody is coming from in this space, but one of the things that's important for us to know is that anthropology matters. You thought you were coming to here to talk about neuroscience, and we are, but it's important to know that anthropology really matters. More than anything, we have to, as I tell the clinicians that I train, I want you to know your neuroscience. You need to know that. But even more so, you must be rigorous in your study of anthropology. You must be rigorous in your understanding of what does it mean for people to be people? What does it mean for humans to be humans? Because if we don't understand that, then we're not going to understand what the point is of why we're doing what we're doing. And so that's the first question that I would ask of you, and it comes in this form. In what story do you believe you're living? In what story do you believe you're living? Long before we encounter patients, long before we encounter clients who are in trouble that we are being called to be helpful with, we have to have some understanding of what the story is that they really believe that they're living in the middle of. I tell people that I believe that I'm living in the middle of a biblical narrative. That's what I tell people that I believe that I'm living in. Now, not everybody here may believe that, but I believe that I'm living in the middle of it most days. There are many moments when I don't believe that, and, like every day at some point, when I become anxious about things, despite the fact that the biblical narrative would tell me there's nothing that we really need to be anxious about. At least Jesus said that, but I find all kinds of ways not to listen to him when it comes to lots of things that I think it should be reasonable for us to be anxious about. In what story do you believe you're living? And here's the other thing that I want to say to us today. We can't give people what we don't have. And so as we talk about these things, I want to invite us to consider that as I'm providing information, as you're hearing information from others who are going to be helpful for you as you help others, I want to invite us to consider that the first question we have to answer is, to what degree are we applying these things to ourselves? To what degree are we finding ourselves in a place in which we are becoming greater people of wholeness, greater people of integration, as we will soon hear? With that in mind, I would posit that everyone here, everyone that we work with, is longing for a world of goodness and beauty. We're longing for that. I would posit further that discoveries in neuroscience over the last 15 to 20 years would necessarily suggest that there is information that points us in the direction of that world that we long for. This world of right relationships, this world where people are not being abused, this world where justice is being done, this world where the goodness and beauty of the world that we long for is actually coming to bear in the lives that we live. And out of that space has come and has emerged this field of what we call interpersonal neurobiology. It's a particular field that I spend my time in. And this is a field that calls from a number of different scientific disciplines, all of which have a stake in answering the question, what is the mind? What is the mind, and what does the mind look like when it's working in a healthy fashion? All these different disciplines are having a stake in that, and they have something in common, and the common ground that they share has really led to a definition of the mind that we'll talk about in just a moment. But this world of goodness and beauty, I want to suggest, is realized most effectively and most consistently when we ask this question, and that is not just what do you know? Like when we leave here, we want to know stuff. How many here came because you wanted to know something new? Anybody here? Right, you just came for the lunch, right? You come because you want to know things. Human beings, we want to know things. And that's a good thing, but it's important to know that part of why I want to know things is because the more that I know, the more power that I have. And the more power that I have, the less I have to trust you. The less I'm not going to have to worry that you're going to burn me. And so knowing things is really important, but I want to suggest to you that even more important than knowing things is the question of to what degree are we known? To what degree are we known by others, for those people of faith, known by God? And I would suggest that you can't really talk about being known by God apart from being known by people. So here's a beginning question that I would ask. We'll come back to this later this afternoon. Could you give me the names, if I asked you, could you give me the names of 3 people who collectively, if I were to poll them, they could tell me everything there is to know about you? Everything. They know what you think. They know what you long for. They know what you grieve over. They know everything. The degree to which we are known, interestingly enough, changes our brains. The degree to which we are known actually makes it possible for my right and my left hemisphere to talk to each other more effectively. It makes my prefrontal cortex more effectively able to talk to my brainstem. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. But I want to suggest that this notion of wholeness, this notion of what does the mind mean and what does it mean for it to be healthy, is predicated on this question of it's moving toward answering the question, how well are we known? And I want to suggest that a healthy mind keeps that question in mind at all times. So interpersonal neurobiology, this collection of lots of different scientific disciplines that has come together and offered us the following definition, the working definition of the mind. And it goes something like this, that the mind is an embodied and relational process that emerges from within and between brains, whose task it is to regulate the flow of energy and information. Right. Do you have that? Okay, so check this out. So 4 years of medical school, 4 years of psychiatric residency, and I did not get not just one course, not one lecture on what the mind actually is. Now, and patients still come to see me. Can you imagine, right? An orthopedic surgeon who couldn't tell you what like a femur is, like that would be a problem, okay? So we don't necessarily know what the mind is, and even if you did know what the mind is, like how do you know that the mind is actually functioning well? When we say this is what we believe the mind is, we want to unpack that definition a little bit. So the mind is an embodied and relational process. First, it's embodied. This is the first thing to know, that the mind is not just something with which you think. The mind is not just something with which you feel. Your body is a crucial part of the mind. How do you know that you're anxious anytime you do? You get sweating under your armpits, like you are right now. I mean, right. How do we know that we're like all these things that happen physically to us? And yet, it's important to remember, like, we live in a world that has, for many, many years, dichotomized, like, split apart what our mind is from what our body is. And so we often don't pay attention to our bodies, but our bodies are crucially important in paying attention to. So then we say that, well, the mind isn't just embodied. Notice, it's not just my brain, right? Neuroscience is cool, but it's not just neuroscience. It's what's happening to my entire body that matters. My mind is not just embodied, my mind is relational. It's an embodied and relational process. When infants, newborns come into the world, around 20% of the neural networks that they need to survive are on board, active, ready to go, and doing their job. It takes the next 3 years for them to actually connect most of the rest of those other neurons, and those neurons have to be connected through interactions with other people, with other relationships. Right, so my brain, in order for my brain to develop, it requires the interaction with other human brains. Something else that's important to know, like we live in a world that would like us to believe that we are all just individual silos. We all like think that like we're here in this room and we're all these individual people living, sitting in the room. I will tell you, if you were the only single person in the room listening to me talk, that would be weird. Okay, because like you'd be in a table out there and I'd be up here on a stage talking to you. But I can tell you that if nobody else was in the room, just you, your experience would be different. And why is that? Because all the other bodies and all the other relationships would be departed from you, and that changes your mind and your brain. So here's the thing that's important for us to remember already. We are both embodied and relational creatures, which helps us kind of make sense of what we hear when we read that the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the earth. He breathed the breath of life into man's nostrils, and man became a living being. This notion that we are dirt and we are breath, and you take either of those away. You take relationship away, you take embodiment away, and we stop being who we are. And so as we take care of people, we have to take care to pay attention to their embodied experience and their relational experience. And one of the things I tell clinicians when we're doing training, we think that patients come in the same way that you think you come here for information. Patients are not primarily coming to you for information. Patients are coming to you for you. You are who they're coming for. When they leave, they don't just leave with information. They leave with the memory of sitting in your office with your face and your voice and your body, looking kindly at them as they talk about their trauma. They're coming for you. Our experience with people is both embodied and relational. But that isn't the only thing that a mind is. We would say that the mind is an embodied and relational process. It's moving. It's constantly on the move. The mind is never actually literally static, although unless you're like a 14-year-old boy. Anybody here take care of 14-year-old boys, like your parents? Have you ever been a 14-year-old boy? Right? You come home and they come home from school and they're like, so how was your day? Huh. Like, wow. Could you please be a little more vague in your response? Right? So we wonder if 14-year-old boys have anything going on, but they do, I can assure you. But here's the thing. Our processes, our movement, has everything also to do with relationships. How many here have ever in your life, no matter what it has to do with, how many here would say, at some point I have felt stuck? Okay, so 20 of you out of a room of 150. Nobody else has felt stuck. You're all lying. All right, so if I feel stuck, we sometimes think that my stuckness is a matter of I just don't have enough ideas. I don't know what the next thing is for me to do. I'm afraid to do. And I want to suggest to you that your stuckness is a function of relational isolation. Movement, again, is a function of the degree to which I am being known at any given moment as far as this is concerned. So the mind, is an embodied and relational process that emerges. It's emergent. And by emergent, we really mean that this is a process in which the whole is larger than the sum of its parts. I'm a guy who likes to control for outcomes. Probably nobody else here knows what that's like, right? But I can be an guy, so I want to know everything that's going on, not just up to the horizon. I want to know what's going on the other side of the horizon, so that I can control for all those variables. That's the life I like to live. I don't like the notion of having to be in a situation in which I can contribute what I do and somebody else contributes what they contribute, and the outcome is going to be something that neither of us can actually control for. But therein lies the way the mind actually works. We actually need to and depend upon others in order for us to work together to create our lives together. In the same way, we have different parts of our mind that we'll talk about, these different domains of the mind that only work in concert like that of a symphony. You could take, because we're going to listen to some music here in a little bit, you could take any piece of the symphony, if it was just going to play one part of the orchestra, we wouldn't really want that. We would want all parts of the orchestra to give us the whole that you wouldn't be able to necessarily predict unless all those parts are playing together. I want to suggest to us, if you've ever taken, for those of you who are clinicians here of any kind, one of the things that we say is that, we can come to the table as clinicians with lots of information that we can use to help people, but the one thing that we cannot ever do, doesn't matter if you're, any primary care people here, all right? How many of you work with patients who don't do what you want them to do? Right? This is the world that we live in. And one of the things that we tell people is that patients aren't really ready to make changes, whether you're talking about hypertension or you're talking about depression. Patients aren't ready to make changes until they've suffered enough. They're not ready to make changes until they've crossed a threshold in which they've acquired enough pain around their situation, whatever that painful process is, in which they're actually then ready to make those necessary changes. But here's the thing, I don't know where that threshold is. And as a clinician, I would like to be able to make sure that I knew where it is. I could draw that line in the sand. But because the mind is an emergent process, I can't control for that all the time. How many of you here are parents? Need I say more, right? How many of us, we want to be able to control the outcomes and the stories for our children, and I can't control for that. And now as a parent of adult children, I find that I'm in a situation in which there are plenty of times when I still want to be in charge of my child's story. Amen? This is a Presbyterian church here. Do people say that here? Okay, I'm just checking. Okay. But you know what I mean. Like, the mind is emergent. And here's the other thing that's important for us to know about this. Like, the fact that your mind is also emergent, it means that there are lots of things about the way your mind works that you don't yet understand. And one of the things, we'll talk about this in the shame workshop, one of the things that's really difficult for us is that when I don't know what I don't know, I hate not knowing everything. But just coming to terms with the fact that the mind is something about which I can't know everything. And what is happening is an emergent process between me and other people's minds. So it is an embodied and relational process that emerges from within and between brains whose task it is to regulate the flow of energy and information. Now, by energy, we mean literally all the bioelectrochemical stuff that's going on, not just within you, but between us. And this gets into physics, and it gets into all kinds of things, the quantum mechanics and so forth. So it's not just the energy that takes place in the brain and in your neurons. It's also the energy that takes place between me and you when you and I are talking. So, for instance, if it's true that 60 to 90%, depending upon your moment, 60 to 90% of all human communication is nonverbal in its nature, tone of voice, eye contact, body language, all those kinds of things, it means that all the things that are taking place literally in the air, my tone of voice as it travels to you, is going to be reflecting what my mind is doing for you, right? So those things that you see, that you hear, that you sense. I've been married for, almost 33 years, and we are still working on Curt actually figuring out that when Phyllis says things in certain ways, that she's not being critical of him. We are still working on that, right? Because Curt still assumes things because of how I'm then making meaning out of the energy that is taking place in the room. Part of the challenge for us is that most of us aren't paying attention to the energy. Most of us aren't paying attention to our bodies. Most of us aren't paying attention to the nonverbal cues that we give. Most of us are just living in the left hemisphere side of our brain that lives in the logical linear processing. We just think that just because I've told you the truth, therefore that's all, that I told you with a tone of voice that sounded like I think you're an idiot is beside the point, right? So energy amounts to a lot of things. Information means something else. By information, we mean human beings are always making meaning out of their lives. Also later this afternoon, we'll talk about this in terms of storytelling. Human beings are always giving meaning to every particular experience that they have, even if they're not conscious that they're doing it. So you walk into a room and you see people that you like and that you know like you, and you see them across the room and you wave to them and they appear to ignore you and turn away and go someplace else. And you give meaning to that. And you've got a range of different kinds of meanings that you could give to it, but we're doing this all the time. And so this notion of meaning making, of the energy that's taking place in my mind as it emerges with yours in an embodied and relational fashion is what we mean by this. So those of us who are people of faith, we would ask the question, what does it mean for me to love the Lord my God with all of my mind? Wow. Now I've got to ask, how do I love God and people with my body? How do I love God and people with the energy between us? How do I love God with all these different ways? What does it mean for us to do that? And how does knowing any of that make any difference for us who are clinicians? So I want to tell you about my friend Steve. Steve came to see me as a patient when he was in his late 50s, and he was depressed. Now, Steve was a scientist, very bright, very articulate, and he'd been depressed for probably 3 to 4 months, fairly severely. And if you were to ask him, he would say that the main reason why I'm here is because I'm depressed because his son 6 months earlier had taken his life by hanging himself. Now, Steve was also aware that I was a person of faith, and he made it very plain right at the beginning that he wanted nothing to do with that. He's a bright guy. He's read the literature. He wants an antidepressant. He's even just seen his primary care doctor, who's tried him on one or two, and that's not working. And so he's giving me the names of the antidepressants that I need to give to him. Right? He's that well read, that well informed. I said, Steve, you seem like a pretty sharp guy, and we want to do something about this. But I want to just find out first if we're going to do this pharmacology thing, which I think is necessary for us to do. If we're going to do it, you also though have to agree that we're going to do some other things in addition to this. If you really want to know what's going on with your mind, because I don't want to just give you a drug without you being informed about what we're actually doing. And he was agreeable to that, and so we start to have some conversations about. What do you think is really a problem? Well, I'm depressed. Well, what does that mean? And we start to talk about what does the mind have to do with this? How does the definition of the mind have anything to say to this? And so we enter into conversations about this, mind you, having nothing to do with faith, and also not yet having to do with the fact that he was necessarily depressed. But we'll get to that in just a moment. One of the next things that we had to talk about with him was look, so we've given you the definition of the mind. How do you know if and when the mind is actually flourishing? Well, for Steve, we could tell that it wasn't. What would it mean for his mind to flourish eventually? So one of the notions that we have in interpersonal neurobiology, we've given you a definition of the mind. One of the notions that we have of what happens when that mind is flourishing is by using the word integration. Now, for some of you who've read Dan Siegel's work, or if you've read any of my work, you might be familiar with this. This word integration in the field of interpersonal neurobiology has a particular meaning. And its meaning really hinges on this notion of a system, any system, a living system, a non-living system, that is both well differentiated in its subparts, and that those differentiated subparts are equally linked to one another. So you have a system, again, like an orchestra. You have 4 different subparts of this. You have woodwinds, and you have strings and brass and percussion, and you want to know that each of these different systems works really well, right? You don't pay good money to go to the orchestra only to have one of them play. You want them all to play and to play well, but you also want to know that each of these systems is effectively linked to one another. And so we'd like to know that the violins are listening to the brass when they need to listen to the brass, and so forth and so on. Our mind is like that. And we're going to talk about what it means in just a moment. Our mind is like that. In that, we want our mind and all the different things that it does. One of the shorthands that we give to our patients about what the mind does is that it does basically 5 things. It senses, it images, it feels, it thinks, and it behaves. So there's an acronym for this. We SIFT-B, S-I-F-T-B, that our mind senses, images, feels, thinks, and behaves. That's an overly simplistic acronym for that. But it's one that we give to patients because we want them to be curious at any given time about what are you sensing in your body? What are you imaging? What are you feeling? What are the emotional contents that are emerging? What are you thinking? And then what are you actually doing with your body? Those 5 different ways are just one way to look at it about a system that is integrated, a system that is integrated. We read this then when we read the Psalm, the 86th Psalm, the 11th verse, when the writer says, create within me an undivided heart that I may fear your name. This sense that our hearts are divided. We have these different parts that are separate from one another. What does it mean for us to be integrated? What does it mean for us to come together? One of the things that we know about how the brains tend to work is that if my brain is going to be integrated, I need your brain to help me do that. If we're going to work through trauma, I need somebody else's mind to help me work through that. You can't just give me something to read and send me home and it's going to happen. I'm going to need somebody else in the room to be helpful with me on the road to integration. And with integration, we like to say that those integrated systems tend to then behave according to this other acronym that we use, this acronym called FACES. Those systems that are flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. So you can give those 5 words to a patient and say, every day, a couple times a day, you can ask yourself, to what degree is my life at this moment feeling flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized? and stable. And to the degree that they're even able to be aware of that is indicative that they have become increasingly aware of now what we talk about as the 9 domains of integration. We're going to walk through these very, very quickly. When we talk about the mind and its different functions, we gave you that kind of overly simplistic acronym of SIFT, what it does in general. But we're talking about 9 different domains now of what all is going on in the mind that is being integrated, that's being brought into this place of adaptivity, right? That's flexible and adaptive, coherent, and so forth. And the first domain that we like to talk about is the domain of consciousness, right? Am I awake? Are you awake? You know, I get it, like it's 12:34, you've had lunch, like I could be in trouble up here because like half of you could be asleep and I can't see you far enough and but you know how it is, right? Are we literally awake to things? Are we alert to things? Like we can be awake and not be alert. And are we attuned to things? Are we awake? Are we alert? And are we attuned? And as we invite our patients into this, we're asking them the same question. But remember, we can't give them what we don't have. The primary functional element of the mind that is part of this consciousness, and by the way, neuroscience, we don't know what consciousness is. We don't really know that. Yeah, we know a lot of what the brain does, but we don't know exactly what it means and how all the mechanics that get us to consciousness. But we do know that when you are conscious, you are awake and you're alert and you're attuned. And the primary function of the mind that we talk about here is your attention. How well are you paying attention to what you're paying attention to? Attention is like the ignition key in the engine, and it drives so much. We become what we pay attention to. What we pay attention to, we remember, and what we remember becomes our anticipated future. How well are we paying attention to what we're paying attention to? How well are we paying attention to what I'm sensing, imaging, feeling, thinking? If I'm not paying attention, I will quite easily behave quite automatically and end up doing all kinds of things that my brain has already been pre-programmed to do, which only reinforces the very things that had me in your office in the first place. So in order for my life to be different, I'm necessarily going to have to change the direction of what I pay attention to. So that's that opening domain, the domain of consciousness. The second domain is the domain that we've talked about already, is the embodied domain. It's the vertical domain. Am I paying attention now to my body and all that that means? I'm able to pay attention to my body. The third domain that we like to talk about is the horizontal domain. The horizontal domain is the difference between my right and my left hemispheres. Some of you may be familiar with this, that when children are developing, the right hemisphere tends to come online first. The left hemisphere tends to follow it, somewhere in about age 2 to 4, somewhere in that range. And when it does, we like to say that then I am always in the business of making sense of what I sense. One shorthand way of talking about the direction of the brain's activity is to say that it operates bottom to top and right to left. Most of the time, bottom to top and right to left, that I'm sensing things that are coming from my spinal cord and my body, and I'm feeling things, all the things that the right hemisphere does, right, with the emotion, with its nonverbal cues, with its internal map of the body, all those kinds of things that it does. And then it sends information to the left hemisphere in which I'm going to give logical, linear, and literal shape and frame to that. But how many of us have ever been in a conversation in which you've said to your conversation partner, well, when we were talking about that last night, and you said, and they said, I didn't say that. And you say, well, yes, you did. Well, no, I didn't. And of course, maybe they did, but that's not what they meant. My dear wife now is accustomed to saying to me, please, don't listen to what I said, listen to what I meant. I said, I've been trying that for 33 years. It's hard, it's hard to know what it is that you mean if you're actually saying something different. Paying attention, again, to what I'm sensing and feeling, and that being different from what my actual words are, for instance, is really crucially important. If you don't know it, I would commend to you the work of a British psychiatrist by the name of Ian McGilchrist and his work called The Master and His Emissary. And it's a book that talks about the effects of the right and the left hemisphere, what they do, and how that actually has shaped culture in the last 400 years. So we pay attention then to the way our right and our left hemisphere works. And one of the things that we know that trauma does, for instance, is that it tends to make it difficult for parts of the brain to talk to one another. And which is why it's so useful and helpful for us to have other kinds of interventions, EMDR and other kinds of things, but that is being helped by another person that helps the different parts of the brain communicate when heretofore they've been unable to because of the trauma. The next part of the next domain that we like to talk about is our domain of memory. We talk about memory in a lot of different ways, but one of those ways has to do with the difference between what we remember implicitly and what we remember explicitly. And by implicit memory, we talk about the things like that have us learning how to ride a bike. We remember how to do that. We're learning how to eat, right? When you get up to leave here today, you're not going to necessarily have to remember how to walk, but that, in fact, is what you'll do. You'll remember how to walk out of the room. But it's not just about that. What about the conversation that I had with a couple where the day after they'd had a fight, they came in and what had happened, they'd started to have a fight in their kitchen after work one day, and in the middle of the fight, he leaves, goes out, gets in his car, and takes off. And if you were to ask him, as we did, like, what was that about, he would say, well, I didn't really want to be in the room when she blew, right? Because I know how these things happen, and I didn't want to say anything more that I thought that might cause that to happen. What he didn't say was, I think I was having an implicit memory of what it was like when I was 10 years old and my alcoholic father would come home angry. And the only thing that I could do in order to tolerate that was to get on my bicycle and ride. And by the time I got to be age 16, I would get in my car and drive. How many of us in this room are acting on our implicit memory all day, every day, and we don't know it? We're fighting with our spouse, but it's really our father who's standing behind her or him. We have to invite people to pay as much attention, not just to what they remember about what they had to eat or the conversation they had yesterday, but the implicit memory that is driven from all the information and meaning that they've given to the first 2 decades of their lives, most of which they're not paying attention to. After the memory domain, we talk about our narrative domain. By narrative, we mean how do we tell stories, and this is where the field of attachment plays such a crucial role, because I don't just tell my story about the facts of what happened to me. I'm also trying to figure out how it is that I tell my story. In a men's group that I run every year, one of the things that we do is we give them the opportunity to tell their story, and each person gets 20 minutes to tell their story. And you know, it's interesting to watch not just the stories that they tell, but how they tell them. For instance, there will be some men who will take 15 of their 20 minutes and talk about like the first 7 years of their life. And then they've got 5 minutes to talk about the next 47 years of their life. And then you have other men who do just the opposite. And you wonder, how is it that like you got 20 minutes, you've got 50 years to tell me about, like how is it that I'm only telling you this much in this much time and not very little about this? It tells us things about how people tell their stories. Our narrative domain, that we tell stories in the way that we do eventually, is what really makes us most uniquely human. We're telling stories all the time. You're telling stories even while you're sitting here. The story that runs through your head is like, this guy isn't really as exciting as I thought he was. You're telling stories like, but he's far more good looking than I thought he was, right? There are all kinds of stories that you might be telling, like, I should have gone to the bathroom. There are all kinds of things, right? And usually it's at this point where somebody actually gets up and leaves. And then, you know, we say, like, yeah, thanks for remembering. And so the point is that there are ways in which we are telling stories all the time that we aren't paying attention to. And we think reality is the way I tell my story, when in fact my story is often being driven by things that are based in all kinds of things that aren't actually as real as I think they are. And we need other people to help us tell a different story by helping us paying attention to all those things that we've been talking about. And after this domain of the story, we talk about this narrative domain, we talk about the domain of state, right? The state domain, right? So we each have different states of mind that we enter into every day. If you wake up, your alarm goes off, you're going to go to work, your brain will be programmed to start to activate certain neural network firing patterns that are consistent with what it means for you to get up out of your bed, go to your shower, go get breakfast and coffee and blow off to work. And you do all that without even thinking about it, right? Most of us, right? If you're going to get up instead and come here on a Saturday morning, it would be a different set of neural networks that would start to fire. Here's the challenge. Most of us practice certain states of mind so well that we don't even know that we're doing it. And we're so fixed in them that we have a hard time exiting from them when we need to. So, for instance, I work at my private practice 3 days a week, and at the private practice, I am master of the universe. And at the end of the day, I get in my car and I go home. I walk in my kitchen where I am not master of the universe, and yet I still act like I am. But, my wife is helpful to quickly, disabuse me of this notion. But the point is, most or many of our difficulties happen because we aren't paying attention to when we're transitioning from one state to another. Because we're not paying attention to a lot. And from the domain of state, we go to the domain of the interpersonal domain. Interpersonal domain is that which helps us realize that we aren't the only person in the universe, that so much of my life is actually shaped by my interactions with other people, whether they're in the room or in my head. And from the interpersonal domain, we go on to the domain of time, the temporal domain, that we are, as far as we know, the only animals on the planet that actually know that we're going to die. And we know that we've been born. And we make up stories in between. One of the important questions that I ask patients, whether they're people of faith or not, it's funny, you don't typically find this word in most psychiatric literature, the word eschatology, right? Like, what's the end of the world for you? What's the big picture? What's it all mean? Most people, even though everybody lives with a particular eschatology. Everybody lives with an awareness and a sense of how their life is going to end. Most of them aren't consciously paying much attention to that. It's important that we draw their attention to it, no matter what it is. And then the last, my friend Dan Siegel likes to use this word, transpirational. What does it mean for us to be paying attention to all of those previous 8 domains, paying attention to all of them at the same time? Well, it's a lot of work. But that is the work that we're called to do. Now, interestingly enough, in the middle of all this work, my friend Steve starts to get an understanding that his depression is a lot more complex than just, I feel bad because I lost my son. Because as it turns out, as he told me his story, which of course he was bound to do as we walked through all of these different domains, as he told me his story, his was one in which he grew up in a family in which he loved science. But his family got worried because he was growing up and loving science at a time when science and faith were having trouble getting along with each other, and the whole notion of evolution was kind of making his parents nervous, and his parents really discouraged him. And so when he went off to college, he didn't just leave his family, he left his faith behind as well. But he maintained his anger at his parents and had been cut off from them for several years. And part of his problem was that he had unfinished business with parents about something that had a lot to do with something that really mattered to him. But he didn't know how to have that conversation because he couldn't learn how to have that conversation with them. He didn't know how to have a conversation with his son. He wasn't just upset that his son was dead. He was upset that he hadn't learned how you have a conversation with a 17-year-old boy. Because he was sure that if he had known, his son would be alive. This was not just about him feeling bad because of a loss. This was about him being ashamed because of all the things that he hadn't done right, leading up to and even beyond his son's death. Does that make sense? It's true that he needed an antidepressant. It was even more true that he needed a new story. Over the course of many, many months, we talked an awful lot about what then happens. We've talked about like what it means for the mind to be what it is and what it looks like for the mind to flourish in an integrated state, and we're made for joy and all those kinds of things. And We've seen what happens when trauma runs over. Patrice is going to be talking about that. It's going to be a great breakout session in these kinds of things, like how do we engage these kinds of things? And what I want to suggest to us is that we're not called just to come up with information. There are going to be lots of tactics that we use, lots of different forms of intervention that are crucially important for us to learn how to do, to master them in order to offer that to people. But as much as we are mastering those things and offering those things for people that will be bringing them to places of health, it's going to be equally important that we are also doing the work ourselves that enable us to make sense of our own stories. One of the things that you're familiar with in attachment research data is that the single most important variable that will predict a secure attachment in your child is the degree to which you have made sense of your own story. Not just the kind of parenting classes that you've taken, not just their education or yours, but how well have you made sense of your own story? The question of what it means for us to be known moves us to a place where we can tell our stories differently. And in so telling our stories differently, move to places of integration ourselves, where we're kind of addressing all of these different things, which, as it turned out, over the period of many, many months, Steve was able to do, but as we'll talk about later this afternoon, not just by himself talking to me. It required other work that we'll talk about. But my encouragement to us today is to know that there's really good news to be had for what the neuroscience is enabling us to learn about. It not only reinforces and reflects, tenets of biblical faith for those of us who are believers, but even for if we're not, more importantly, it really gives us tools that can enable us to help people tell their stories differently while giving them practical application of these neuroscience tools along the way. Now, here's something that we're going to do something to wrap this up, because I'm at 12:50. We're going to end with just in a moment. But here's one thing that I want us to think about. We started with me saying, I really do believe that more than anything else, we long for a world of goodness and beauty. And when we say those words, we don't always have a sense of beauty, we sense it, we see it in all kinds of forms. But one of the things that's important and helpful for us to do is to give our patients an idea of what that means. What does it mean to have a life that is a life of beauty? And one of the things that we're doing with patients is that we're asking them, and we're going to talk about this in more detail this afternoon, we're asking them to imagine, with all of their brokenness that they walk in with, we want to invite them to answer this question: what's the next new beautiful thing you want to make? And by that, I don't just mean a piece of artwork. I mean, what's the next new beautiful thing that you want to make with your marriage, that you want to make with your children, that you want to make with whatever? And in the process of that, giving their imagination a jump start on what it means for them to have an integrated whole life. Here's one of the ways that we do this. We actually invite people to actively, in many, many different ways, and as often as they can, we ask them to put themselves in a position of being in the path of oncoming beauty. So we invite them to listen to particular kinds of music. We invite them to get involved in artwork. We invite them to do a range of different things in order to actually turn their brains onto that. So we're going to do something. It's going to take 2 minutes of your time, but I'm going to ask you to stand. And one of the reasons I'm going to ask you to stand is, as many of you may also already know by this, if you stand and plant your feet and put your hands on your hips for about 2 minutes, or, anybody here, not personally, but Usain Bolt? You know the runner, Usain Bolt? Yeah? Yeah? What does he do when he crosses the finish line? Right, exactly. He raises his hand. When you're at the rock concert, when you're at your favorite band, what are you doing? You're raising your hands, right? Well, what are you doing when some people, I know, not Presbyterians, but other people, they might raise their hands, right? Right in church, right, you worship it, right. How do we, it's interesting, right, that when you raise your hands, you hold them elevated, you raise the oxytocin levels in your brain, right? Those neurobiological components that enable you to feel better, here's what's interesting. Toddlers, you don't have to teach, when they come running to you, what do? They raise their hands. You don't have to teach them this. You don't have to teach them this. So here's what we ask people to do. Now, of course, they'll say like, well, do I have to do this in public? Like, no, not on the street. Because this might feel weird. So I'm going to ask you to invite you to consider doing this. Now, of course, like, you're going to look around, you're going to wait for everybody else to start to like raise their hands. Okay, but we're going to play 2 minutes of music. And when we're done, I'm just going to ask you a question, all right? So we're going to play the music, and I want you, and you'll recognize some of it, but I want you to feel free, if you want to raise your arms when we do this, okay? Begin. Thanks. Have a seat real quickly. I'm just going to wrap up with this. What do you feel? Energized. Tingly. Relaxed. Freedom. Connected.
Part of something bigger.
Part of something bigger. Worship. Jupiter. Oh, very good. Have you been there? Yes. Yes. Okay. What I just want to point out that, you might think like, well, gosh, Curt, what, are you going to give him Holst's music and you send him out and you say like, your life will be better? Just go listen to the middle 2 minutes of Jupiter. We know that life isn't that simple, but we know that life is that beautiful. That's what it's intended to be. And we know that if we don't intentionally practice putting ourselves in that space, it would be difficult for us to imagine that space ever arriving. And I want to suggest to us that that piece of music and many other things like it represent what it is that we are inviting people to enter into. That you are that beauty that you hear in that music. And I want to suggest that it is possible for us to live into that space to the degree that we ourselves are being cared for by others so that we may also offer the kind of integrative care that we want to the ones that we take care of. Thank you for your kind attention, and I'll stop with that.